Worship is something we do with all our heart, our mind, our soul, and our strength. Worship, this is an important one. We are to worship God with reverence and awe. And I think of all the places that we go sideways, this may be the one place that gets most abused. We worship God with reverence and awe. Why? Because He is awesome. Awesome means specifically something to be feared. He is the great and powerful, all-knowing, all-present Creator God who loves us and has sent His Son to die for us. And we show up at church sometimes like it's some kind of a hip-hop dance party. And God is pleased to be worshipped in any number of ways and styles. But they must be reverential. They must be biblical. They must represent His holiness. And I'm not talking about whether it's with rock and roll or with country music. I'm not talking about style. I'm talking about truth. Because I've heard rock bands that sing the truth. And I've heard country artists that sing the truth. I don't like country, but they're singing it sometimes. Not all of them, but you know what I'm saying. It happens. I've heard modern worship music that is powerfully beautiful and truthful. And I've heard ancient or old hymns that are powerfully beautiful and truthful. Conversely, I've heard ancient hymns that are abysmal, terrible doctrine. I've heard modern hymns, and this is where we get beat up a lot with modern contemporary music, is so much of it is trash. I just hate to say it. It breaks my heart to say it. But what's happening right now in the church as it relates to music, I believe if we're still around in 1,000 years and Jesus hasn't come back, we're going to look back at this period of musical history of the church as the dark ages of worship in the church. Because what we've got is not much less than worship of Baal, worship of false gods, worship of self happening all across this land. And the worst thing about it is that we're now exporting this as American Christianity through our missionaries to other countries. When I see, I don't have a PowerPoint, but just some of the stuff, it's evil and wicked, and it just sends me off the edge. And a lot of it's played on the radio. We have to look at the source. Sometimes it sounds good. Sometimes we listen to it and say, there's everything in there is right. Well, let me ask you, if a secular humanist wrote a song to God that had truth in it, would you sing it? You have to look at the source. Is the well corrupt? If the source of the water is corrupt, then the water is corrupt. We have to be very diligent. It's a painful task. I'm telling you, selecting music these days is a painful task. My wife and I go over everything, and I have a huge bullet point list of criteria it has to meet. I have to know who are we worshiping. Can I give you an example? For a fairly modern song, Oceans. Who's heard that song, Oceans? It's pretty modern. Spirit lead me, where my flesh is without borders, so on and so forth. The whole song doesn't mention Jesus one time. The only reference to God is when she says, Spirit lead me. Outside of the context of this church, you can import that to a Buddhist temple and they could sing the same song. You can import that to any Hindu, will sing that song happily. Just Spirit lead me? What Spirit? There's no biblical references. We only ascribe context because when we sing it in church, we, I hope, most of the time mean Holy Spirit. But outside of the church context is gobbledygook. It's meaningless. It's nonsense. Another one. There's a line in the song, and the song is pretty good up until the point where he starts singing about our God has robbed the grave. Who's heard that song? Our God has robbed the grave. Why do I have a problem with our God has robbed the grave? Number one, because God is not a robber. Number two, because he didn't rob the grave. He had victory and he conquered the grave. Number three, because that's what the world has been saying all that we stole him from the grave. And now churches all across this land are singing it. It's shameful what's happening in music these days. But there is good stuff out there. We must worship him in spirit and in truth. We worship him in reverence and in awe. He is a holy God. And if we can't give him the holiness that he is due, then we're not worshiping him. We can worship him with some of the greatest music, but if our hearts aren't there, and if we're acting like fools while we're doing it, it's not worship. We worship him in reverence and in awe. Why do we worship him that way? Not because I say so, because he says so. And he's God. And he gets to make the rules.